olam. Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. Okay, now this evening we are going to be looking at the 11th chapter of the book of First Kings, and this will show us the decline and the fall of Solomon's kingdom, and then his death at the end of chapter 11. So that's the spoiler alert right there. We see that King Solomon dies in the end. So this lesson here begins with basically talking about Solomon's wives and his concubines and so forth. So let's go ahead and read that, and we'll get this. Here we are in chapter 11. You can see on the screen, and the decline and the demise of Solomon. And here in First and Second Chronicles, that would begin in that would be the ninth chapter. Actually, would be the end of Solomon's reign, and this is the map of Solomon's kingdom, as large as it ever got. It's as big as it ever got. It's widest influence and everything you can see there. Actually, Solomon did not have to fight or do anything for this. He inherited the entire thing from his father David, and so he had actually no wars to fight during this entire his entire 40 years of his reign. And so we also look at, and I think next week what I'm going to do also, before we get into some of the other aspects of the Rehoboam, Jeroboam, and those guys, I want to talk next week about some of the things how was life in that era. What kind of industry did they have in that time frame? What did the people eat? How did they live? What houses did they live in? There's a real interesting article I'd like to bring you next week on the dyeing industry, not death industry, but the dyeing of cloth, how important that was to this part of the world, and what a lucrative business that was for Israel. And it turned out that it was right in this area along the coast here at between Akko and Tyre, that they had a great functioning factory of the Murex snail trade, where they would turn this stuff into a purple dye that was very, very, very expensive, and only very wealthy people or royalty could utilize, or could wear that kind of a purple. And so I thought that would be kind of interesting to look next week about some of the culture around that era, before we go on to see how the tribes were then split up, and what that meant to everything economically and geographically, all of those different kinds of things. So I thought that would jump a little bit out of the Bible and give you some background stuff next week. So that's where we're going to be. And all right, so let's go ahead and get into the words tonight, to the chapter. In 1 Kings 11, 1-3, now King Solomon loved so many foreign women besides the daughter of Pharaoh. And there were Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites, from the nations of whom Adonai had said to the children of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor they associate with you, for surely they would turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon clung to them for love. And so he and 700 wives as princesses and 300 concubines, and his women led his heart astray. Now, um, Solomon's accumulation of wives here was uh, exactly, I mean, it was in direct conflict with Deuteronomy 23, uh, 3 through 9, and Deuteronomy 7, 3 through 4, where, I'm going to go ahead and read those things that, it, well, you've got it there, the notes there, but if you were to go back into those and read them, just no one of foreign relations, no one unborn of forbidden relations is to enter the community of Adonai, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants are to enter the community of Adonai. No Ammonite or Moabite is to enter the community of Adonai, even to the 10th generation. None belonging to them is to enter the community of Adonai forever. Because they did not meet you with bread and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, son of Beor, from Petor in Aram Naharaim, to curse you. But Adonai, your God, refused to listen to Balaam, and Adonai, your God, turned the curse into a blessing for you because he loves you. Okay, so uh, basically, he's just saying, do not be with these people. We don't want to be associated with those people because they will do bad things. They are very persuasive. Their their worship of the gods was very very persuasive, and God knew that these women from the foreign tribes would they would turn the husbands away. I mean, this idea of the worship of the foreign gods was very pervasive, very persuasive, because of the nature of it. And basically, Solomon, he just abandoned all the Jewish culture, and he went in and he just emulated. He became, just whatever the Eastern courts were doing. Well, I want to do that too. I want to be like just like all of the big guys, the Assyrians and the Babylonians and just all of these different groups. And so he fashioned his court after this same thing. And then here is a slide regarding his how he had these different wives, and kind of an interesting slide. Is very busy, and you might need, after you get all of this later, you might want to go back and look at it, and you see that there are some names that you might remember before this one here. Abishag was the Shulamite woman, the young girl that they brought into David's um, court, into his bed, to kind of warm him up and to see if they could get him to revive in his old age. That was a common practice back in those days. But the Bible says that she never had any intimacy with David, because he was too old, and he was beyond that, no matter what. And so anyway, Solomon then took her as one of his wives, and so that she was not a wife to David. So that would not have been forbidden. It was just kind of one of those things that make you want to go, hmm. So anyway, um, then you see Naamah. That was, now this was an Ammonite, and so the firstborn of Naamah was Rehoboam, his firstborn son. That was who succeeded him in the on the throne of Solomon. And so there the and we see here that Naamah was Solomon's only wife, who is named, and only after Solomon dies when she's mentioned as the mother of Rehoboam. So none of his wives played that big a part in, or enough of a part, that they even had names. They were not named at all. They were just talked about as they were chattel, basically, in many ways, and they were part of his political hold on the region, because if he could marry women from the various kingdoms around him, then he figured that the people would not be um, they would not be as likely to attack him. And maybe that did work, because he had 40 years of peace. However, having 700 wives and 300 concubines, I don't think there are that many kingdoms around him. So and the Bible did said that he did it for love, because Solomon loved women. So he may have been the most wise man in the world at the time, but his wisdom did not extend to his own life and his own lifestyle, because you can imagine what would happen if you had a number of wives. And I don't know if you can read this screen very, very well, but it's the first little picture says uh, Solomon saying, "Honey, what's for dinner?" And then the answer that comes back is just a cacophony of different answers, from leftovers to roast lamb to fruit and dates. And somebody says soup, and the other one says, no, we want to eat out. And the other one, let's bring in Chinese, and and so on and so forth. So the answer is Solomon saying to himself, I guess that's what I get for having 700 wives and 300 concubines. Okay, so that is my joke for the evening, or at least that's the first one for the evening. Okay, I can't promise you that I won't try something again. All right, so let's go ahead. Any comments or questions on this so far?
When it came down to Solomon's son that they named, was that really the firstborn son or just the only son that they named when it came
As
to his?
as best we know, that is the firstborn son, rather than just the first one that was named, because it could very well have been, had it not been the firstborn, there could have been conflict.
Okay.
And so, with the Middle Eastern time, that firstborn was a very, very important position to be in.
Yes.
So, as best we know, that would have actually been the firstborn son, and in fact is the only son that is named.
Okay. And
Okay.
why only the number to 1,000 basically women?
Why just 1,000 women
Yeah,
instead
like
of a
why did he
thousand
do?
and one?
Yeah, like yeah, I saw that. I was like, what stopped him?
What stopped him? Well, I'm not really sure. I don't know that we have an answer for that. Why there were only 1,000 instead of 1,001, and because it's uh, it's kind of like me out in my woodworking shop, I guess, and clamps, wood clamps. A man can never have enough wood clamps in his woodworking shop, and so maybe he did get to the point where he says, "Okay, I've got enough wives," and so forth. And it could very well be that the 700 and the 300 is uh, it's a nice round, generally round number. We just don't know. The
Okay.
answer is we don't know, and
Okay.
so I can't really tell you, and I'm not going to sit here and try to make something up. Okay, so
Yeah, I thought maybe his mom probably said, "Okay, that's enough."
oh well, no, I'm not real sure. Um, but going ahead with the fourth and fifth verses here, um, it says, "For it came about as Solomon grew old that his wives led his heart away after other gods, so that his heart was no longer wholly devoted to Adonai his God, unlike the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom or Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites." Okay, so um, there's a couple of things here that, well, I'll show you the pictures of it. There's Ashtaroth, but his wives did lead his heart astray, and that his heart was no longer wholly devoted to Adonai. Basically, he still had a part of him that clung to Adonai, so that he didn't just totally give up Adonai, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But there wasn't a whole lot of room left in there for the true God. And so he did. He went after Ashtaroth. Now, these are depictions of Ashtaroth, and you will see that they basically what they are is she was a fertility goddess. And so, being a fertility goddess, you can imagine then that the worship of this goddess entailed a great deal of sexual licentious behavior that we would look at and say, well, that's not right. But the men of the day would say, oh, yeah, let me have some of that, because they had temple prostitutes. It was a way for them, the men of the era of the time, to say to their wives, well, hey, honey, this is the religion. We have to do this. And so, that's why it was so easy to turn the men away from Adonai, because that's certainly not the way that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob worked. You didn't have that kind of behavior with him. So that's you see that now. They also mention Molech or Milcom, same guy, same person, same God. One of the things that the Canaanites did that was so detestable to God and to all of the their his whole way of being was the sacrifice of children, basically the firstborn of a family. You see that these guys are putting firewood inside this big bronze thing, and they heated it up red hot. And then you see one of their priests handing a live firstborn child into this. And what it doesn't show is that this area right in here would be open, and they would take and lay that child right there on the grate, and it would be burned alive. And that was their sacrifice, so that they would have prosperous crops, and that they would have rain, and that they would have peace, or victory over their enemies. And so, whatever, there was always some kind of an excuse to offer up the firstborn of the Canaanite families. And they did this for centuries and centuries. And that's one reason why God said, these people are under a ban or a banishment. That's why Israel was to take and kill them all, to try to blot out this terrible way of idolatry. And if they didn't kill them, he says, banish them from the land, move them out, push them out, so that none of them are left alive in the land. And yet Israel did not do that, to their detriment for basically the rest of the existence of Israel. And so they would get rid of the child, or they would kill the child as an act of piety, of worship for the deity there, Molech or Milcom, and which is, that's that terrible as it is. Even today we have something like that in the abortion industry, only it's not worship, it is convenience. People get rid of a child because they get it's convenient. They're putting themselves, that basically they're worshiping their own lifestyle more than the life of the child. And so Um, and I believe everybody knows my thoughts on abortion, and so we'll just go on from there and saying it is an abomination to God. All right. So let's look at verse 6 through 8. And again, any comments? Just jump in there. I wanted to talk just a second about the Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians. This goddess, the same as Astarte, is also called Ishtar in Mesopotamia. In Syria, she was the female consort of Baal and a model for the Greek Aphrodite. She was the goddess of fertility and erotic love. Canaanites worshipped her with an unbelievable licentiousness. It's not so unbelievable when you think about it. It is not difficult to see why a man like Solomon went after that kind of a goddess. Now, Milcom, that was the abomination of the Ammonites. It's called, and no one knows any difference between this abomination and Molech. Okay, it's all one and the same. The terrible fire god who to whom infant children were sacrificed. There's no record of Solomon ever offering such a sacrifice, but even if he did had done not such, even if he didn't do something like that, I don't think any Jewish writer would have ever mentioned it if he did. So, and he certainly built a temple to Molech. In fact, Rehoboam was the only son of Solomon mentioned in the Bible. Raises some question regarding the reason why, and Vanessa pointed that out. The worship of Molech was terribly common in Jerusalem, and with the accompanying sacrifices, they didn't stop it. And the temple to Molech was over on the Mount of Olives, for goodness sake. So, going ahead. Yeah, so Solomon did what was evil in the sight of Adonai and did not fully follow after Adonai, unlike his father David. At that time, Solomon also built a high place for Chemosh, the detested thing of Moab, on the mountain near Jerusalem, as well as for Molech, the detested thing of the children of Ammon. Thus he did for all his foreign wives who were burning incense and offering sacrifices to their gods. So this was not an aberration. This was a common thing for Solomon to grow to build temples for the wives and their deities. Now this is one of Chemosh, and he was the national deity of the Moabites, and he is a sun god, and he was also their god of war. He's called the in Judges 11:24. He's called the god of the Ammonites. The mount in front of Jerusalem, as I said, is the Mount of Olives, and that's east of the city. That's where they built this a monument to Chemosh, and he was the twin brother of Molech of the Ammonites, and so he was equally cruel, licentious, and vulgar in his demands of the people. So let's go ahead. Adonai became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from Adonai, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice already, twice. He had commanded him about this, that he should not go after other gods, yet he did not keep what Adonai had commanded. So we see here, God had already come before uh, uh, Solomon and warned him. He gave him warnings about this kind of behavior. And for some reason, he never let the wisdom that God gave him uh, turn his heart toward God. It always went the other way. He turned toward his wives, and so that's a problem that you see with mankind all along, is that we may know what is right, and we can actually see it, and in our heads we know it, but then somehow in our being we follow after the bad things. And so that is just this is a classic example of where man doesn't do right, because he lets his heart overload what he knows that is right. And I believe that God wants us to use that brain that He gave us, and to be able to think about things and to justify them uh, through our intellect, and not just through our base nature, like the men of that time would be. Said, okay, this is a great opportunity for to me to have uh, wild and riotous sex with somebody, and so that was, that was a very attractive thing to a lot of the men of the day. And so when and I mean, it would be very attractive to people today. In fact, we see that, well, in our own society, how that the certain cultures that certain areas of the world are famous for providing that kind of entertainment, and in fact, that's a major part of their industry. If you look at maybe Amsterdam and Thailand, and throughout various places in the world. There, those are two that just kind of come to mind. That the idea of the prostitution is very, very attractive to many people, and of course, with that comes all sorts of other bad things. The slavery, sex trade, and all of that. So that another reason why God says don't do that kind of stuff. So this last time that we'll see later on in the chapter, God appears to Solomon one last time. The first two times it was for a warning, just instruction. This is what I don't want you to do. The last time was for judgment. And so that was at that point it was all over for Solomon and his kingdom. In the 11th verse, so Adonai said to Solomon, since you have done this and did not keep my covenants and my statutes that I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will do it. I will not do it in your days for David your father's sake, but I will tear it away from your hand, of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear away the whole kingdom, but will give you one tribe to your son for my servant David's sake, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. All right, now the this judgment was because of Solomon's disobedience. We see that. I mean, he directly went against God's uh, commands, in the law of Moses, and also God's personal appearances before Solomon, eh, that said, "Look, don't do this kind of behavior," and yet he did it anyway. So Solomon is without excuse. He he may have been the wisest guy, and he wrote beautiful poetry and all of that kind of stuff, but he in my estimation, he sold his soul for earthly pleasure, and for basically sexual pleasure. He sold his soul, and only God knows what eventually the final resting place of Solomon might be. I'm not going to try to make that kind of a judgment, but it would surely seem that Solomon threw away any blessing that he would have had from God, and it said his kingdom would be divided. He would get one tribe. Now, as we see, the it would be delayed in that he would not see it happen. That the nation would be split apart after he is dead. Why? Because of the faithfulness of David. David, he did some bad things, but he never ever uh, went into idolatry, and he never turned away from God. He was a flawed man, and so when he did something wrong or bad, he always went back to God and asked forgiveness. And that's why the Bible talks of David as being a man after God's own heart. So this talks about one tribe would remain for Solomon's son. Um, Going back up here to you see this area here um, of their kingdom. The one tribe would have been this area. You look, if you can see my cursor down here, that it would cover this part from Jerusalem and all of the southern part of Israel. That was the tribe of Judah. It was the major tribe. And then up here in this part, that was the major part, was the tribe of Ephraim, and that's what Rehoboam then was the Jeroboam. I get Rehoboam and Jeroboam messed up, but the northern tribes, uh, Jeroboam was the one in the north, and so he got the 10 tribes. Well, what happened to the other tribe? Well, if you remember, down here in this part of Israel, and from Beersheba down to Kadesh Barnea and Tamar, there were 18 cities that were given over to the tribe of Simeon. And basically, what happened was that there were prophesied that Simeon would just vanish away, it would just go away, and that's exactly what happened. They were just absorbed into into Judah, and some of the Simeonites actually then they left and they went up into the northern tribes where they were further assimilated. So uh, if we went, and let's go back to where we were then. Okay. Then Adonai raised up an adversary to Solomon, Hadad the Edomite of the royal line of Edom. Earlier, when David was at war with Edom, Joab, commander of the army, went up to bury the slain and had struck down every male in Edom. And Joab and all Israel remained there 6 months until they had cut off every male in Edom. But Hadad and some Edomite servants of his father had fled to Egypt while Hadad was a small boy. All right, and then going on. Hadad was Edomites. They were, if you looked, they were to the southeast of Israel. That was that kingdom there. And so it's interesting that when in the Bible, when it talks about the God raised up an adversary, the word that he uses there in the Hebrew is Satan. It is actually Satan. He raised up a Satan against Solomon. I thought that was kind of interesting. When you read the Hebrew, sometimes you get a word that'll just pop up, and that one just popped up to me, and it says, "Oh wow, he raised up a Satan," the same word that we would use against Lucifer, the our adversary, but that's what he called him, is the a Satan. And then these are external adversaries, and Rezon, the son of Eliada, he was up in the north, and we'll talk about him in just a minute. So now I wanted you to look at the trade routes that, because this was important. You remember that from up in here, uh, right here, and this you see this Allah here. That is it shows well, there was actually a city there, or a trade place that Solomon had, that where his ships went out of there and then down here, and then they were able to go on out to India and China, and that's where they brought in a lot of their goods. There was also the Silk Road. This one went through Damascus, and so then there were roads down this one road that went through Petra, called the King's Highway, and then there were other trade routes that went from Damascus down through Israel, um, along the coast to Gaza, and then on into Egypt. And so these areas, these trade routes, were very important to the economy of Israel. And remember that Solomon got a lot of money from the taxes or the tariffs that he charged on goods that went through Israel. And so he had fortified cities, and so people they were on the roads, and if they didn't stay on those roads, they would have to go through mountain passes and all sorts of very difficult things. It would be like us today taking an 18-wheeler. Well, because we didn't want to take the toll road on through a city or through a state. Well, we just decided, okay, we're going to cut off and go through this farmer's field, and that way we don't have to pay the toll. It doesn't work very well when we do that. So, and it's the same way. People had to go through the toll booths, and um, Solomon had those things well fortified with lots of men and chariots and so forth. And so he could enforce it. He got lots and lots of money that way. Trade routes were very important to Solomon. So let's go ahead then and look at setting out from Midian. They came to Paran and took men from Paran. We're talking about Hadad the Edomite, and took men from Paran with him, went to Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who gave him a house, allotted him food, and gave him land. Then Hadad found great favor in Pharaoh's eyes, so that he gave him his own sister-in-law, the sister of Queen Tahpenes, as a wife. The sister of Tahpenes gave birth to his son Genubath. Tahpenes weaned him in Pharaoh's palace, and Genubath remained in Pharaoh's palace among Pharaoh's sons. So here we find another foreigner that is taken into Egypt and nurtured and brought up in the Egyptian culture under the protection of the Egyptian. Now here's the map that I wanted to show you before. Here's the kingdom of Edom, okay, and this is the Moab and Ammon, and then of course up here, this is where the Rezon was from. He was up in this area. So, and these, you remember that trade route that went through Damascus and down here, and then goes through. It went down through this area here. Well, look here. Over on this side, you see that Solomon controlled all of this land here, and this King's Highway, as it were, went through Damascus and then on down along to present day Amman, Jordan, and down here went through Petra, and from there to a seaport that they could go then to India and China. And so very, very important to be able to control these trade routes. And so we see that Egypt, again, provided refuge for the enemies of Israel. And we'll see in just another couple of generations that Egypt then would war against Israel, and it would be devastating for Israel. Now, this Egyptian wife of Hadad of Edom, Hadad the Edomite, that was again one of these political things where they would give them a wife, and then okay, so now you're part of the family, so you can't fight against your family. All right, and so that's why you saw that in that time frame. You also saw it, years and years, generations, 1,000 years later, all throughout history, where kingdoms would be cemented together with the thought of, okay, if I marry my daughter off to this king over here, he will not attack me, and perhaps then I'll even have a chance to take over his kingdom. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. It always has been. All right. So when Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers, David died, and that Joab, commander of the army, was dead, Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Let me leave so that I may go to my own country." Then Pharaoh replied to him, "What do you lack with me? All of a sudden you seek to go back to your own country?" "Nothing," he said. "Nevertheless, let me go anyway." And so here, Hadad, by this time, okay, how old was he? We don't really know. It was he would have had to been of an age where he would have been a full man at this point. That when David died, and so we really don't know how old he was, but he was old enough to gather an army and to lead an army against Israel. Um, then God raised up another adversary against him, Rezon, son of Eliada, who had fled from his lord King Hadadezer of Zobah uh, when David killed them, and then gathered men to himself and became a leader of a marauding band that went to Damascus and dwelled there and gained control in Damascus. So Rezon was an adversary to Israel all the days of Solomon, adding to the trouble that was Hadad. He despised Israel while he reigned over Aram. So there you go. There's he was up here, this kingdom of Aram, Damascus, and this is Syria today, and he controlled that area up there. Okay, and that was always a problem then for the entire time of Solomon's reign. Um, and, all right, so there's a thing that I found here talking about just the not the connection but the similarity of Rezon and David, and how that they there were two they had some similarities, many similarities, and that it just was kind of an interesting thing where they had both of them were a servant of a king, and they were not of royal blood themselves, and they flee from their lord like David fled from Saul, and they gather a band of people together. They become guerrilla forces against the reigning monarch, and it was just kind of an um, interesting comparison between the two. But we see that Rezon was a thorn in Solomon's side the entire 40 years. He never conquered, but he was just a pain to him for the whole reign of Solomon. And then there was that. Now we've shifted over from the external adversaries of Solomon to an internal one. There was Jeroboam, son of Nebat, the name of his mother, a widow, was Zeruiah. He was an Ephraimite. He was from the tribe of Ephraim, and he was from the city of Zereda. Although he was Solomon's servant, he also raised a hand against the king. Now, the reason that he raised a hand against the king was this: Solomon built the Millo and closed the breach of the city of his father David. Now, the man Jeroboam was mighty in of strength, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he appointed him over the entire labor force of the house of Joseph. All right, so this guy was Solomon looked at him and said, "Okay, this guy's got lots of potential," and so he put him in charge of things. And he was. It says that he raised his hand against the king uh, because he had built the Millo, and there were times where David and Solomon did things that were against some of the other tribes. You remember the Benjamites never really forgave David for the for deposing their boy King Saul. Remember, Saul was a Benjamite, and so they never really forgave him for that. They were always kind of a reluctant then a reluctant a follower of David. I can't think of the right word right now, but they were with David, but they were still, we may do it, but we don't like it, and they never were comfortable with David. And so something that Solomon did there with the Millo, building this fortress um, that that was one that built up the city of David even further. That somehow bothered the Ephraimites. So, but it didn't bother him enough to go ahead and do his job. It found out that Jeroboam was very much a very capable man, and he was, they called him a man of valor, and so um, he says he raised his hand against the king, not so much as fighting against him, but the possibility was that he was not afraid to go to Solomon and uh, tell him what he thought about things. And he certainly then raised his hand against Solomon's son Rehoboam. Okay, so and he appointed him. Solomon was not afraid to appoint somebody to. All right, now this was. I'm going to go ahead. I don't know how long the internet's going to fool with me now, but we're going to talk about the prophet Ahiah, and it's one of those things that I kept looking at the name Ahiah, and that's kind of an English way of, or they somehow put that into an English word, and if you look at the Hebrew, there is no J in there, and so I will be pronouncing Ahia rather than Ahijah or whatever, however somebody from Texas would pronounce it. But in the Hebrew, it's Ahia, and so he's a prophet. He's from Shiloh, and he went out and he covered himself, it said, with a new cloak, and he met with Jeroboam, and he took that new cloak that he had and he ripped it into um, into 12 pieces, and basically he's telling Jeroboam, he says, take these 10 pieces, and those are going to be your part of the nation of Israel, and then the rest it will be for Rehoboam, and so I mean, that what a graphic way of saying, showing this picture here. And he said, and the reason for that, he says, because they have abandoned me. Now Solomon has abandoned me, Adonai, and to worship Ashteroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, and god of Moab, Milcom, the god of the children of Ammon. And they have not walked in my ways, nor done what is right in my eyes. Now, nor kept my statutes and my ordinances as his father David did. So I will not take the whole kingdom, but I'll keep him as a ruler all the days of his life for David's sake. So Solomon is not going to see all of this happening, and he said, "Yet I will take the kingdom out of my son's hand, and I will give it to you, Jeroboam, the 10 tribes." And so, and to his son, to Solomon's son Rehoboam, I will give one tribe. And actually, that was one tribe being the tribe of Judah, one of the largest, and that had absorbed the tribe of Simeon. And so, therefore, Simeon was really not a tribe anymore. And so, that's why he would give 10 up to Jeroboam and then only one to Rehoboam. And that was all of the tribes, being as how the Levites were scattered all throughout Israel on both sides, and they were not to be given to anybody. They were to serve God wherever they would be. So, but he says he's going to do this, but he's going to wait for David's sake, and that he says this will afflict David's seed, but for not all days. In other words, this was not going to be an everlasting punishment. All right, so we see that Ahiah was a priest and a prophet from Shiloh. Shiloh was where the tabernacle had been for 380, almost 400 years, and so that was a priestly community, and lots of priests were born and raised there. And so that tearing of the cloth, what a graphic as to tearing up the nation of Israel. And so, finishing up the chapter, therefore Solomon sought to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam got up and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt. He remained in Egypt until the death of Solomon. Now, the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did in his wisdom, are they not recorded in the book of the acts of Solomon? So the days of Solomon's kingship in Jerusalem, overall, Israel was 40 years. Then Solomon slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of his father David, and of his son Rehoboam was king in his place. So I mean, what an end! It just ended up there, and we'll see that again. Egypt was a refuge for the people in the area that the king, the pharaohs could see. Okay, if I give them refuge, that may be politically expedient for me later on, because then that way I could these people um, would would be able to assist me, and Pharaoh wanted that strip of land of Israel because of the trade routes that went through there. And we'll see that later on, Shishak did actually attack Israel. He's the first of the. He's actually the first Pharaoh mentioned by name in the Bible. Before, they just talked about him as the Pharaoh. That is a title, and it's a specific title for in the Egyptian um, language, I guess, that would say, if you say Pharaoh, then that means he's the king in Egypt. That does not mean he's the king of England. Okay, so if you say Pharaoh, you automatically know that that is Egypt. But it doesn't talk about Pharaoh Ramesses or Tutankhamun or what are the other names. But Shishak is the first one that's mentioned in the Bible. And so then Solomon's obituary here, very, very short and sweet, considering his wealth and his all of the things that he had, and how he had made Israel such a such a wealthy nation, and he had built the temple to God and so forth. So it's kind of interesting that it would be just, yeah, and then Solomon died. And so there are a lot of things that we could go back and do a big study on the life of Solomon, and it would be kind of a tragic study, actually, because he had so much potential, and in the world's eyes, he lived up to that potential because he had so much wealth, and the 1,000 wives. Now, I don't know that that would be considered a blessing, but he had the 1,000 wives anyway, and so um, even with all of that, what's that? The 1,000 wives and so forth. That was a sign of his wealth, not a sign of his smarts. Okay, and so um, having all of that, and then it just said, yep. And then Solomon died, and his son took over.